There's a specific kind of silence that fills a courtroom just before a verdict is read. It is not peaceful. It is not calm. It is the silence of people who have stopped breathing in any meaningful way. Hands pressing flat against thighs, eyes that have gone still, bodies held carefully in place as though movement itself might somehow alter what is about to happen. Everyone in that room had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. The judge had not yet spoken. The jury had returned and taken their seats. The papers were arranged on the desk. Everything was in its place. Everything was ready, and the people who had come to witness the end of something long and painful sat with the particular stillness of those who have finally arrived at the thing they were dreading and find, now that it is here, that they cannot look away from it. And then Nancy Guthrie did something, not something loud, not something that broke the proceedings or demanded attention in any obvious way. Something that several people in that room later tried to describe, quietly, carefully reaching for words with the particular deliberateness of people who understand that what they witness does not have easy words, as the moment they will still be thinking about long after everything else about that day has faded. It stopped people mid-breath. It didn't just change the silence in the room. It deepened it into something else entirely, something heavier, something with a different texture than the silence that had existed moments before. What she did was not grief-shaped for an audience. It was not defiance. It was not emotion deployed strategically in the hope that someone watching would soften. It was something that seemed to come from a place none of those things live in. Something that spoke not to the verdict waiting to be delivered, but to the full accumulated weight of everything that had brought her to this particular room, on this particular day. To understand what that moment actually meant, you have to go back much further than this courtroom, further than the case, all the way back to a life that, from the outside, looked like something that would never lead here at all. The town where Nancy Guthrie built her life was the kind of place that does not announce itself. No reason for anyone passing through to slow down. No particular feature that draws attention from outside. But inside it, among the people who had lived there long enough to have history with one another, there was the particular texture of a community that has grown up around shared time, where people know each other's names before they have been introduced, where the rhythms of daily life are held in common in the quiet, unremarkable way that happens when families live in the same spaces across generations. Through school pickups and neighborhood routines and the long, slow accumulation of being present in the same rooms until presence becomes familiarity, and familiarity becomes, without anyone deciding it, something close to belonging. She was woven into that fabric, not visibly, not in the way of someone who sought a central role in things, known in the quieter and more lasting way, the way that comes from simply being there, year after year, until your presence is simply part of the place. She had history in that town, real history, the kind built from ordinary proximity over a long period, not from anything dramatic or deliberate, the kind of place in a community you occupy, not because you engineered it, but because you kept showing, up until it was yours. The people who knew her in the years before any of this became part of any record describes someone steady, someone you could rely on without having to think about it. She understood her relationships and her responsibilities, and she met them the way genuinely reliable people tend to meet things, not with announcement, not needing acknowledgement, simply because that was how she had chosen to be in the world. There was nothing in the version of herself she offered to the people around her that suggested anything difficult was developing underneath. No visible tension, no behavior that, in retrospect, stands out as something that should have been looked at more carefully. She appeared, to the people who loved her, to be exactly the person she had always been. That is the part of this story that takes the longest to absorb. Not the legal facts, not the procedural history, the simple fact that nothing showed, that the people closest to her had no idea, because according to reports and documents that eventually became part of the formal record, there were things happening beneath the surface of that ordinary life that those people had not been permitted to see. Circumstances building quietly, choices being made in private spaces that did not correspond, in any visible way, to the version of her life that existed in the open. Pressures accumulating in the places where her daily life was not visible to anyone who loved her. The legal process that eventually brought all of this into the light took time. It was not a case that resolved quickly or neatly, and it was not designed to. It moved with the weight of something genuinely complicated, something that required sustained, careful work to establish, that produced developments along the way which surprised people who had been following it closely, and that asked of everyone connected to it the particular cost of living with unresolved uncertainty. Over a long period, the community held it the way small communities hold things personally. These were not people following a case from a distance. They were people living alongside one, absorbing each new development as it arrived, trying over and over again to reconcile what they were learning with what they had believed they knew. By the time that courtroom filled for the verdict, those people had been carrying this for a long time. The exhaustion in them was real and specific. Not the tiredness of a single hard day, but the deep fatigue of sustained emotional proximity to something that had never quite resolved. They were ready for the waiting to be over, and they were not ready for what Nancy Guthrie did before before the investigation, before the case had a number or a name or any place in any official record, before any of this became a thing that strangers would eventually follow. There was simply a life, and that life, by every available measure, looked completely fine. Nancy Guthrie moved through her days in ways that the people around her recognized and trusted. She was present in the specific, unglamorous way that genuinely dependable people are present. Not in grand moments, not when the stakes were visible, but in the ordinary daily continuity of being there. She was the one who remembered things, who followed through on what she said she would do, who understood, without needing it explained, what the people around her needed from her. The words people who knew her used to describe her carry a consistency that suggests they are all trying, independently, to name the same truth, reliable, grounded, someone you could count on without verification. These are not words offered out of sentiment after a loss. They are the words people use when they are trying to be accurate, and enough different people arrived at them to suggest that accuracy was what they were reaching for. Her days had the texture of a life that fits together, recognizable rhythms, established patterns, the kind of continuity that, depending on how you hold it, is either deeply comforting or quietly constraining. She appeared, from everything that has been reported, to find it manageable. She had been inside these particular circumstances long enough that navigating them no longer required conscious effort. She knew her environment. She understood its dynamics. She knew how to keep things stable. What the people around her did not know, what they were not permitted to know, according to the proceedings that would eventually unfold, was that beneath the stable surface, there were pressures that had been building for a long time. Financial tensions, questions about money and property, and the slow, grinding kind of disagreement that develops in close relationships when resources become contested, when conversations that start as practical gradually acquire harder edges and become something neither party fully acknowledges, but both parties feel. These were not things she had discussed with the people closest to her. They were part of what was being held back, part of the private architecture of her situation that the visible life did not reflect. People who look back at that period now, with the knowledge the proceedings eventually produced, describe something they could feel in retrospect, but could not have named at the time. A weight being managed that did not show on the outside. A layer of her life that was not accessible to them, not because they failed to pay attention, but because it was being actively kept from them. The particular effort of someone who has decided, for whatever reason, that the people around them should not know what they are actually carrying. There is something quietly extraordinary about that kind of sustained effort, to show up reliably in the visible life, day after day, while the invisible life operates on entirely different terms, to maintain the ordinary exterior while something significant runs beneath it. Most people cannot imagine doing it, which is part of why it is so difficult to see from the outside. The last ordinary moments of this period were ordinary in every conceivable way. Nothing marked them, nothing asked to be looked at more carefully, just the continuation of familiar days, with all the casual certainty of days that have no reason to be the last of anything, until the continuation stopped being what it appeared to be. It started with something small, the way these things almost always start. No official conclusion has been reached on every dimension of these questions. The proceedings were the appropriate place for them to be examined fully, and they moved at their own pace. But by the time the verdict date arrived, the general shape of what had been found was no longer ambiguous to the people who had been living alongside it. They were not waiting to be surprised by what the evidence had established. They were waiting, only, for the formal world to say out loud what they had already been carrying as real. Verdict days carry their own specific atmosphere. Anyone who has sat in a courtroom waiting for one understands it in their body. Before they can put it into words, the compressed quality of the air, the way time moves differently, simultaneously slower and more irreversible than normal time. The shared understanding, present in everyone in the room regardless of which side of the proceedings they occupy, that whatever is about to happen cannot be taken back, will have to be lived with, has already, in some sense, begun. The room that gathered for this verdict carried all of that, and something additional. The weight of months, the gradual accumulation of details that had arrived without warning and settled into people in ways they were still processing. The particular fatigue of a community that had been trying, for a long time, to hold something in understanding that kept expanding beyond their understanding. Everyone in that room had been waiting, some of them for longer than anyone should have to wait for something like this. And then, in the moments just before the verdict was read, in that specific, concentrated window of held breath and absolute stillness, Nancy Guthrie did something that changed the quality of what the room was holding. The people who were present have spoken about it afterward with the careful, measured language of people trying to be honest about something that resists being described. It was not an outburst. It was not a performance aimed at the people watching. It was not emotion deployed in the hope of producing a particular effect. It seemed, to the people who witnessed it, to come from a place entirely different from any of those things. Something that registered not as a thing being done for the room, but as a thing simply happening within it, private in some essential way, despite occurring in a public space, in front of people who had been watching her for months. What they witnessed, according to those present and reports from the proceeding, was something that can only be described as arrival, the quality of a person who has finally, fully reached the place that everything preceding this moment has been building toward. Not defeat, not resignation in the ordinary sense of that word. Something more complete than either. The specific settling that happens when there is nothing left to position yourself inside, when the navigating is over, when every version of events that could still be held onto has finally been released. It stopped people in the room, not loudly, not with any external drama. It shifted the silence from the silence of anticipation into something else, something heavier, something with a different texture, something that several people found themselves returning to privately in the days after, because it had lodged in them in a way that even the formal verdict, for all the weight it carried, had not quite managed to do, because it was, in its quiet and unintended way, the most honest thing that happened in that courtroom across the entire length of the case. A verdict is a legal determination. It answers the question the process was built around. It establishes, formally and finally, what the evidence supports. And that matters enormously to the people whose lives it reshapes, to the community that has been carrying the weight of the case, to the record that will exist long after everyone in the room has gone home. But a verdict is not the whole of what a day like that contains. It is not the only thing the people in the room carry out with them. There is the formal determination, and then there is the human texture that surrounds it, the particular quality of a day that represents, for everyone who lived through the case, the end of something very long and the beginning of something whose shape is not yet visible. For the people closest to this situation, the ones for whom it had never been abstract, never been something they followed from a comfortable distance, the verdict represented one kind of closing, not the closing of their experience of it, which would continue in the private, structureless way that experience always continues long after external events have reached their formal conclusion. But the formal closing, the official recognition that what months of careful work had established, was now part of the permanent record. For Nancy Guthrie, the day held something different, something more immediate, more personal, more unavoidably real, because whatever she had carried into that room, whatever internal relationship she had maintained with the reality of her situation across all the preceding months. The verdict was the point at which the external world's accounting of that reality aligned fully and finally with what she had always already known. That alignment, according to those who watched her, was visible, not theatrically, in the quietest possible way, in the specific stillness of someone who has arrived at the point beyond which there is no further travel, where the distance between a situation and its consequences has closed completely, and what remains is simply the experience of being inside the closing, the moment that had stilled the room before the verdict was read, the one that shifted the silence, that lodged in people in ways they are still processing, was the precursor to this, the moment when the arrival happened internally before it happened formally, when everything the case had built, everything the months of proceedings had established, landed fully in a way that was visible to the people watching, even though it was never intended for them. What it cost her, in any private and personal sense, is not something any formal proceeding can account for. The proceedings addressed what they were designed to address, what lives beyond them, in the ongoing experience of the person at their center, in the lives of everyone affected, in the slow and structureless way that a community recalibrates after something like this moves through it, is not something any verdict reaches or is meant to reach. What does it actually mean to watch someone arrive at the full truth of their own situation in a room full of strangers? It is not comfortable. It does not produce the satisfaction that people sometimes imagine will come at the end of a long and difficult legal process. It produces something more complicated and more lasting than satisfaction, a sobered, settled stillness that the people who were in that courtroom carried home and have not entirely set down. The moment before the verdict will remain, for the people who witnessed it, the most enduring thing about that day, not the legal language, not the formal determination, not the procedural conclusion of months of careful work, the human moment, the unguarded, unmanaged, fully real human moment that happened in the small space between the waiting and the knowing, the moment that was not performed for anyone and could not have been. That moment was not about legal consequence in any technical sense. It was about something underneath that, something more fundamental, about a person being fully, finally, without any remaining layer of protection, in contact with the reality of what had happened, what it had cost the people around her, what it had done to the life she had built, what was now, without any possibility of revision, simply and permanently different. People who live through cases like this one, who carry them personally, not from a distance, are sometimes asked afterward what the experience gave them, what they came to understand by the end that they had not understood at the beginning. The answers take different shapes, but there is a thread that runs through many of them, a recognition that arrives, quietly and without announcement, through the specific experience of living alongside something like this. It is the understanding that the lives closest to us contain things we are not always shown, that the person whose presence you have taken for granted for years, whose rhythms you know by heart, may be moving through a private space that you have never been permitted to see, that the surface of a life and the full life are not always the same thing. That trust, extended across years of familiarity, reaches into territory that familiarity alone cannot map. That understanding does not make people suspicious of the ones they love. It does not hollow out what they return to, but it makes them more present, more attentive to the questions that closeness and routine make it easy to skip over, more willing to actually ask. Nancy Guthrie's story does not end with a clean moral or a lesson that can be carried forward in a few sentences. It does not work that way, and the attempt to make it work that way would be a dishonesty of its own. It is the story of a person whose choices, made privately over a sustained period inside circumstances that the people around her never fully understood, eventually led to a room where those choices were named out loud and accounted for in front of everyone who had been part of the case. The verdict was the formal end of one chapter. The lives continuing after it are the beginning of another, quieter, longer, less structured, and far less defined by anything external. Those chapters are being written now by the people who were in that room, in the private hours that no proceeding reaches. What stays is the moment before the verdict, the shift,